Välkomna till Global Gains-podden. Idag ska jag, Pär Ståhl, och min kollega
Karl Lans
intervjua Morten Springborg, sa det på danska, men jag hoppas att det duger. På C Worldwide. Morten är, vad ska man säga, temaanalytiker. Är det rätt?
Global thematic specialist, as we call it in C Worldwide. Yeah.
Jag har ju varit och lyssnat ganska frekvent på dig när du har varit i Stockholm. För du sitter normalt i Köpenhamn på ert huvudkontor. Och idag har vi tillfälle igen att få podda med dig på riktigt stora teman. Nästa vecka är det måndag, så är det ny president i USA. Då svär man in president Trump för andra gången. Vilket sannolikt kommer att få implikationer på finansmarknaden, världsekonomin och inte minst inom nyhetsmedia där det kommer att vara mycket tweetar och nyheter på morgonen. Men jag lämnar över till min kollega Karl Lans.
Väldigt intressant att höra hur Morten ser på utvecklingen i den amerikanska ekonomin efter att Trump tar över här. Very nice to have you here, Morten. And we'll start there, I think.
Okay,
What's your view of the US economy with Trump as a president?
I think it is, we are at a point in history where I don't recall having the degree of uncertainty as we have today because of many, many different things, not least because of the uncertainty that Trump introduces, because he is all over the place and his ideas are many times contradictory. So it is very, very difficult to prognose where things are actually gonna go over the coming 2 to 4 years. But I am also of the opinion that the next 2 years are gonna be completely crazy because of the urgency that the new administration feels to change the trajectory of the economic model in the US. And he has appointed some very, very impressive people in his administration. He has significant powers at his hand, at least for the next 1 year before the election cycle kicks in again and we have midterm elections in 26. So I think it's going to be crazy.
It will be more crazy than the last 4 years he was in power, do you think?
I think he's, of course, very much more well prepared now. He now knows how to operate the power of the US and he has prepared himself for it. He was totally unprepared last time when he got in 2016. So yes, I think it is going to be unprecedented change that we're going to see. Then you can question how much can he actually in reality change, because a lot of it is also legislation that he has to put through Congress. And many of the things will probably not be possible to do, but he has very, very big levers himself. So I think we should fasten the seatbelt and be prepared for some very, very big changes.
And how do you prepare for an event like this?
Well, the way that we do it is actually try to look longer term to companies that can kind of cruise through this kind of volatility that we're seeing here. But I think for the shorter term oriented investor, it is going to be very, very difficult because we don't know actually whether we are going to go into a more inflationary or less inflationary environment in the coming couple of years, because it very much depends on which of his priorities that will come out on top. And maybe we can start there because I actually think that you can talk about Trump's impossible trinity of ideas. He wants to, of course, reduce inflationary pressures in the US, because if there's one thing that is highly, highly unpopular, and one of the reasons why he probably got elected with the mandate that he has, it was because of the inflation under Biden. That was extremely unpopular. So he has to control inflation, while at the same time he wants to cut down on immigration and actually send people back, which is of course an inflationary event in itself. And then he talks about tariffs. I don't know if tariffs is going to be an endpoint or it's a tool for him to negotiate outcomes that he prefers. I tend to believe that the tariff threat is not to be over-dramatized, because I think it is more a tool in his negotiating toolbox. But of course tariffs are also inflationary. It's a tax on consumption in the US, and therefore it goes straight against his primary objective to be very popular amongst his population. And also he wants to of course, to move manufacturing capacities back to the US, something that we've been talking about in Sea Worldwide for the last 5-6 years, that we are in the beginnings of a new manufacturing supercycle in the West. We want to get less dependent on China. It's going to be extremely difficult, but I think actually the US has been most forceful here. You can debate where Europe is in this story, but definitely there are policies in the US that tries to move manufacturing back to the US, and tariffs will help convince companies to move back to the US, but it's going to be inflationary, and also tariffs are actually also a strong US dollar positive, which means also that America enterprises are going to be less competitive if tariffs are introduced. So the totality of it is that we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know what happens over the next year on macroeconomic variables in the US, because very much depends on which of these things will actually happen. So you can say today the consensus is that the economic activity in the US will continue to be strong, and there's going to be certain levels of inflationary pressures in the US. You can see that interest rates in the US have gone up. It's very, very unusual, the things that has happened in bond land since Federal Reserve lowered interest rates in September. Federal Reserve have lowered Fed funds by 100 basis points, and the long end has gone up 100 basis points. We've never seen that before. Normally, these two interest rates, they follow each other. So there is now being priced in a higher degree of long-term uncertainty about economic policies in the US, and that is being priced in the bond market. I think that, for example, if Doge and Ramaswamy and Musk are successful in cutting federal expenditures dramatically, and that is what their plan is, I think actually it's going to be something that will be to the detriment in the short term to US corporate profitability. And the reason is that there is a direct connection between deficit spending and profitability in US enterprises. We've seen that as the deficits in the US has expanded, the profitability in US companies have actually been going up. And if they should be successful of lowering the deficit in the US from what is currently around 7% of GDP to the long-term target of 3%, that is going to be a big deflationary force in the US economy that will be seen immediately in the profitability of domestic businesses in the US because of the smaller, liquidity injection into the economy from a deficit in the US. So if that was to be the case, we are going to move from an inflationary environment to something that is more deflationary, and you should definitely buy long bonds. But we don't know. So that is the uncertainty right now, and why also we favor to focus longer term, to look out 3 to 5 years and see if we can find companies that it's actually capable of compounding their earnings through this uncertainty. That has always been our investment model, instead of trying to play the shorter term market.
Do you favor any particular type of companies in 3 to 5 years in the US?
I think that, of course, technology will continue to be a favored investment area. Now, what is happening, for example, in the space of generative AI is that we're moving away from all the excitement about building the models to now applying the models, and we're going to have agentic AI hitting the market. We're going to have generative AI agents operating tasks in corporates over the coming 1 or 2 years. That's going to be a huge theme. One of these agentic models is going to be robots. We're now starting to see, for example, a company like Waymo in the US operating autonomous taxi services in San Francisco. They have a market share close to 25% now. And this is the early innings of autonomous driving in the US. We're seeing the same thing happening in China. I believe that Berlin is going to be the first town or city in Europe that will actually see Waymo services. So that's one example of autonomous technologies taking over, but it's also going to move into the factory floor with the use of humanoid robots. Maybe not within the next year, but I'm quite optimistic over the next 3 to 5 years. We're going to see a significant pickup in humanoid robots in manufacturing because so many companies are now throwing a lot of capital at it. And the reason why we should be optimistic around it right now, we've been talking about it for the last 10 years and not much has happened, is that generative AI is actually an accelerant for the deployment of humanoid robots. It's a way to actually teach these robots to do what we want them to do.
Will all this robotic scenario, will it increase the productivity for the companies, and is it good for the GDP growth as well?
That's a very, very important topic, because if you look at the drivers of GDP growth, it is it's labor market growth plus productivity growth, and then you can add on some debt to, in the short term, enhance your GDP growth. And we know that demographics are turning negative. It has turned negative. The US continues to be the best geography from a demographic point of view, where you have a labor market that is marginally growing, while in Europe we have actually a quite dramatic deterioration in labor market demographics for the future. Actually starting right now, where we're starting to see big reductions in labor market pools across the continent in Europe, and of course China, the same thing. So all other things equal, you would assume that it's going to be very, very difficult to have positive growth rate for GDP in Europe. And historically, GDP growth in the US has been growing, let's say, assume 2% productivity. And on top of that, you could perhaps put 1% labor force growth. So in total, you would have a structural growth rate of the US economy of 3%. Now, that is going to be reduced to something more or less like productivity, because labor markets in the US is not going to grow that much. And in Europe, we have actually had very, very low productivity growth compared to the US for the last 15 years. I think the average for the last 15 years in the US has been 1.6%, and in Europe it's 0.8%. So assuming that we have negative labor market growth in Europe of the tune of 1%, it's 0.5% to 1% depending on country, we barely grow in Europe for the coming decades. So let's hope that actually AI can lift the productivity, because we definitely need that added growth impulse into the economy. And I think the US is in a much better position to actually take advantage of it, where we in Europe have a more fearful relation to AI. We more fear it than we see it as an opportunity, and that's something that we have to change. It's also a fact that many of these technologies are not developed within Europe because our business environment have not been conducive for business development in Europe, in contrast to, for example, China and the US. So we most likely will be using technologies that are developed by other continents. But I see it as unavoidable that we will need to embrace technology, including AI, in order to automate as many job functions as possible, because we will be lacking the people.
And do you looking for that kind of companies that can do that? Is that one of your target companies?
We definitely do. It is still an open space, you can say, that we're very, very early in the development here. We prefer to buy companies where we have a clear picture of the longer-term market opportunity, who are the players, and are we on a sustainable growth trajectory in that particular business area. So if you, for example, look at robotics or humanoid robots, that takes a lot of this is actually an area where you're starting to see that AI is going from software and the computer to actually physical hardware, and there are many companies, for example in Japan, that are very, very much exposed to the rise of humanoid robots, because they are suppliers of the components that goes into these machines. So that's an area that you can actually start to look at and invest in today, because these companies are well established already. So that's an early area where you could allocate. But of course, many of the very large technology companies of today that everybody knows, like Google and Nvidia, are also investing significant amounts of capital in the deployment of humanoid robots. For example, last week, NVIDIA was out with quite a lot of product announcements on the targeted humanoid robot development.
Morten, how does big government influence economic growth in the coming years, do you think?
That's a topic we have been talking about for the last, 10, 15 years, and we published a white paper on the rise of big government a couple of years ago, and we have developed our thoughts around it more since. Big government is this idea that we are moving away from free market capitalism as we saw it in the years after Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s. That was the period when everybody saw the state as being the problem. And I think actually today, increasingly, people are seeing the state as the solution for the problems that we are in. And it's kind of a big pendulum that has swung from one extreme, and it is going towards the other extreme this decade.
When did you see that last time in the history?
I think it rhythms very much, and we probably don't have time to talk about it, but it rhythms very much with the ideas generated by, or developed by Howe on the forced turning, which is this idea that generations are driving economic and social change in our societies. So the story is that I think last time we were in this kind of environment was in the 1930s. And we know what happened at the end of the 1930s. That is basically
all too well.
That's basically what we have to avoid. But I think that we are actually on track for continuous rising conflict driven by the rise of big government. We're moving away from globalization towards regionalization or directly nationalistic thinking. And you have a challenger nation in China that is rivaling now the US, and the US is fighting back. And China and the US will do whatever is necessary in order to mobilize forces in the domestic economies to stand the challenge of the opponent. In the case of the US, which is what I'm mostly focusing on, we have for a number of years been on a unsustainable fiscal trajectory. We know now that the US has a debt to GDP of 120%. Fiscal deficit is 7%, and 7% deficit in a period of zero unemployment basically in the US, and maximum economic output is unheard of. 7% deficits normally is associated with deep recessions. So we can only imagine what happens if and when the US goes into a recession. We're going to have double-digit fiscal deficits. Now, the situation in the US is that approximately, more or less, it depends a little bit on how high the tax revenues are, but more or less all the tax revenues in the US now goes to what is considered to be mandatory legislated expenditure, like social security and Medicare. All the nice stuff, which is discretionary, is on top, and it is deficit financed. And one of the components that is growing very strongly in the US is interest expenditure. So now next year the US will be spending 4.6% of GDP on interest payments on the debt. And that is, in contrast to Sweden. Sweden pays 0.1%, and the US is 4.6%. And it is growing. Our view is that we in the US today has an interest rate, a real interest rate, that is simply too high for the US to cope with longer term. You can contrast it with what has happened in Japan over the last 20, 30 years. The Japanese government has a government debt to GDP that is more or less twice as large as the US. But the Japanese interest expenditure to GDP is approximately 1.5%. So how come that the Japanese cost of maintaining double the amount of debt is 1/3 the US? And it's of course that in the Japanese system, they have suppressed interest rates. They have had interest rate control for many, many years. It's a little bit more complicated story, but the basics of it is that they have controlled the cost of capital in Japan in a manner that has led to very low cost of having this very, very large debt. The cost to the Japanese economy is that the value of the yen is extremely low. The yen has not been on a purchasing parity level, been as low as it is now in recorded history, more or less. In contrast, the US have a very high real cost of debt. I think the real interest rate in the US is now approaching 2.5%. It is very, very high compared to any period since the financial crisis almost 20 years ago. And as a result of that, you also have a very, very expensive dollar. Now, we believe that, and this is also based on what Scott Bessent, the future Treasury Secretary in the US, has said, we will see changes to the way that the world economy is structured around a reserve currency, because the US can no longer actually operate efficiently and go up against a Chinese competitor being as uncompetitive as they are with this very, very high expensive dollar. Scott Bessent is a guy that I have deep, deep respect for. His background is impressive. Not to go into detail, people can look it up themselves, and you can listen to podcasts on the web. I take what he says with a very, very deep respect, and he recognizes that something has to change. The funny thing is also that the Chinese also want something to change. You have the whole story around BRICS currency, MBridge, etc. So when you're listening to the water pipes in the monetary system, you sense that something is going to happen. And I think Trump is an agent of change to change a monetary system that has now been operating since 1971 when the US went off the gold standard. And it has had its due day because it is unsustainable. Many of the things that is happening in the US economy and many of the things that is happening in the Chinese economy. The Chinese can no longer follow the peg of the dollar because they are in a deflationary bust. So something has to give also in China. And timing this is completely impossible, but I think it's going to happen the next 4 years under the auspices of Trump. Maybe in a negotiating. He's a guy who fames himself for being a deal maker, and there are many things that could be dealt with in the relationship between China and the US, and I'm sure that the currency regime is going to be also on the table.
So we're going to see a weaker dollar.
I think the dollar, not necessarily this year, because there are many different currents happening this year, but I think if you take like our normal investment horizon is 3 to 5 years, and I think it's fair to say that over the next 3 to 5 years, yes, you're going to see changes to the international monetary architecture that will lead to a weaker dollar. It is necessary for the US to have a weaker dollar. Otherwise, it is totally unsustainable what is happening fiscally in the US.
And how do you position your portfolio according to this?
Well, we are concentrated stock pickers, so we use themes in order to understand where the world is moving towards, and we try to invest into companies that are exposed to areas in the world economy that will see growth in the coming years, and where these companies can profitably grow with the expansion in that market opportunity. We only need 30 companies. So I'd say that these macro considerations that I'm talking about here are inputs into the stock selection process, but it's not something that is driving our allocation process. Our allocation process is driven by the ideas we get from analyzing companies. And as a result of that, we are underweight the US, and we've been underweight the US for a long time. That has not been what you should have done from a top-down approach, but from a bottom-up approach, it makes perfect sense for us. And we find many very, very interesting stories, not only in the US, but also in Japan, in certain emerging markets, and in Europe. And one of the big investment ideas for us that is kind of associated with what I talked about, generative AI, is that we are moving into a world where we are going to see more fragmentation in manufacturing. China is the world's most competitive manufacturing system. China's manufacturing output is today probably around 32% of world manufacturing. The US is less than 15%. Europe is less than 15%. That has to change, and that means that manufacturing capacities will be moved to the West. This is the reshoring story, And the way that we have positioned ourselves here is that we want to have exposure to companies that actually provide the machinery for these future factories in the West. So that is companies like Atlas Copco or Siemens, or just to mention two that we have in our portfolio. And good thing is actually also that now we are standing here today, and the U.S. equity market is 70% of global equity markets. But if you look at what is required for this story to play out, you will actually have a demand for companies that are many times outside of the US equity markets, because engineering, capital goods manufacturing is not necessarily something that the American enterprises are excellent at. You find these types of companies in many European countries like Sweden, in Germany, in France and Italy, and you find them in Japan. So I think this is actually also a door opener for a return to certain components of the equity markets in countries outside the US that kind of have been forgotten over the last 20 years in all our excitement around software, which has of course been driven by the US.
Do you see some kind of revival for Europe, or is it a dream more that Europe will get back on track again?
We have, from a top-down view, been very negative on Europe for 10 years, and I think Draghi's report was something that we talked about like a decade ago. So that people suddenly realize that we have a problem because Draghi is writing about it, that comes as a surprise to me. It's been obvious for most investors in Europe. I think the fundamental problem in Europe is that we are 27 national markets, small markets, where there's no scale effects. You have a big market in the US, you have a big market in China, and you have 27 small markets in Europe. With all the different regulatory barriers across this continent, that's a huge barrier for growth. And the other thing is also, but we shouldn't move into it, but of course also the euro is a big problem. It's as it is today, it is unsustainable. And that keeps away investments from the European continent because companies realize that the longer term outlook is uncertain. We also have all the issues that I've talked about for a long time about the stupidity of European energy policies that has handicapped growth because we have a scarcity of energy and we have very high prices for energy. So I'm actually not that positive around Europe yet, but I think it's positive that we understand the problems, but I have so far not been able to identify politicians that have been able to actually get a hold of the root problems and address them. We lack political leadership in Europe, and the unfortunate thing is now the US has very strong political leadership. China has very strong political leadership, and Europe is in a totally opposite position. Certain things have happened, for example, Sweden and Finland joining NATO, that increases the relative power of the Nordics. Also, I believe in the EU cooperation. You also have a sensible political new direction in Poland. So you can say that certain Northern European companies are starting to hopefully become a strong force in European politics. But it's a long way yet. We have big divide between France and Germany, and you know that when the French-German engine is not working, Europe is not working.
You're Danish, and Denmark is the land of one of the most innovative companies in the world. I mean, Novo Nordisk, it's a huge success. Yeah. It's the largest company in Europe. The companies, they are still innovating in Europe. You have ASML, and you have lots of success stories. You mentioned in Siemens, Atlas Copco, and so on. Yeah. Do you see that innovation is still on track in Europe?
Well, the good thing is that the bottom-up story in certain industries is strong in Europe, in contrast to the top-down. And before coming into the positive stories, I'd say that the innovation and small company development growing bigger is something that we lack in Europe. We have had very, very little creation of significant new companies in Europe for the last 50 years. And that's, of course, a problem, and we need to address that in Europe. But then looking at existing large players, yes, you have definitely a lot of very capable companies. I mentioned capital goods companies, engineering companies, where we are at the forefront of technology development in Europe. and Japan, and then in the pharmaceutical area, where I would say that Denmark is a really center of in biotech, not least because also of Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is plowing back a lot of, Novo Nordisk is foundation owned, and the foundation, I believe, has 44% of the equity, and all the dividends they receive is basically paid out in grants to for example, pharmaceutical development in other companies and universities in Denmark. And that the spillover effect from that has been massive in Denmark, and has created a lot of smaller, very ambitious companies in that space. So I think that's a very strong area for Europe that we have, and it goes maybe into this overall story about what should Europe invest into. In Denmark, it is very, like, the politicians in Denmark are still talking about renewable energies as being the growth driver of the Danish economy or the European economy, and that we should expand into hydrogen and windmills and solar panels, and basically industries that have been lost to China, and where Chinese manufacturing capabilities now actually has resulted in them having a cost advantage that are massively bigger than what we have in Europe. So I think it's important that we start to talk now about where should Europe invest if we really want to have industrial policies in the European area like they have in China and the US. Maybe we should not try to copy what they have already done in China successfully and where they dominate global markets, because we will never be able to catch up with them, and instead focus on the core strengths areas where there's still the opportunity to actually grab significant global market share. And that continues to be in biotech, I think. It could be in certain areas within AI, although it seems that most of that is going to the US today. And then, of course, in manufacturing, in engineering, etc., where we have historical strong positions. So maybe just to conclude on this, where I guess we have been all over. I think we're going to go through some volatile time here now with Trump. We are kind of going back to the jungle, and small countries like Denmark are being run over with the latest comments on Greenland, for example. Mm-hmm. So that is a new environment to operate in. But I think we should also be optimistic if you kind of take a 5 to 10 year view, because technology is progressing and is going to be addressing many of the issues that we have. And I think it is important that you have a global view. I think that we are now in the beginning of 2025, standing here looking at the US as being the only thing out there that is worth looking at. And I think actually it's a mistake if you take a 5 to 10 year view, because I think there's going to be dramatic change in the world economy over this time frame. And I'm not particularly optimistic about the politics of Europe, but I think that Europe has some very, very strong industries that are well placed to participate in the growth that is going to happen over the coming 5 to 10 years. And that's what we will want to take advantage of.
Thank you very much, Morten, for your insights. Tack så mycket till alla som har lyssnat. Och nu ska Karl Lans köra en disclaimer.
Vi vill påminna om att allt som diskuteras i denna podcast är gästernas och våra egna åsikter. Ingen del av samtalet ska betraktas som investeringsråd. Gör alltid din egen analys eller rådgör med en kvalificerad finansiell rådgivare innan du tar investeringsbeslut.